Well, let me start by saying good morning to everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Hoffines, and I'm the president and co-founder of the Lisbon Council. We're delighted you could be here on this very special occasion. As I think everyone knows, we're going to be, first and foremost, launching the 2020 edition of Education at a Glance, which is, of course, the OECD's flagship publication on education and skills. We have the director of the Directorate for Skills and Education, Andreas Schleicher, with us today to present. Andreas, as many of you know, is one of the finest presenters in the business, and I should actually shut up and just hand the floor over to him. But don't worry, I won't. I have a few things to say about that first. Afterwards, we have two extremely good speakers. Silvia Merisio has kindly agreed to join us from the European Commission. She'll be stepping in for Fabrizio Benini, who unfortunately got called into an urgent meeting this morning. And of course, Victor Negrescu, who almost needs no introduction, certainly not here in Brussels, an outstanding member of the European Parliament, a member of the Committee on Culture and Education, and of course, the rapporteur on digital skills in the Parliament. And finally, of course, there are all of you. We're delighted you could be here with us. All of us, the Lisbon Council as well, are experimenting with these new formats. But towards the end of this meeting, or I should say in the second half, we'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat room. I will read some of them out if I need to, and we will try to call on as many of you directly as we can. This is intended to be interactive, a little bit like a school in its own way. We don't think that the experts are going to solve this problem. The only way all these problems are going to be solved are when we all come together and work together. And we hope, I hope, that this meeting will be an example, a shining example of that. Look, maybe I just say a few words and then some announcements, and I hand the floor over to Andreas. All of us know that we've just been through a very long lockdown. It, of course, did an enormous amount of good. It helped contain a terrible, terrible virus and saved many, many lives. But it also came at a tremendous cost. Just last month, the chief economist of the IMF, Gita Gopinath, had to revise the IMF economic predictions down by an additional 2% retraction. The IMF now thinks the economy this year will shrink by 4.9%. That is the worst recession the world has seen since the 1930s. 95% of the countries in the world are projected, and I love this, this is IMF speak, 95% of the countries in the world are projected to see, and I quote, negative per capita income growth. Now, behind those clinical words are some very difficult problems for many people around the world. Of course, there are three things that accounted for this. One was the first half of the year was even worse than we thought. Secondly, we had to keep social distancing longer than we thought, and many of us are still practicing it. And finally, the global supply chains have taken a real hit. Trade is expected to shrink by 12%. And of course, the risks could go either way. We could see another breakout of the virus, or we could see a vaccine. So we don't really know what's going to happen. Look, I think the worst damage, and we'll be talking about this today, as is unfortunately so often the case, has come to the low-skilled. For many years, we've seen rising inequality in the world. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the difference in skill levels quite closely tracks alongside of that. If you are high-skilled, globalization has probably been a very good thing for you. If you are low-skilled, it hasn't. And this crisis, as awful as it's been, has in many ways simply accelerated the trend that we saw in motion already. Andreas is going to be taking us through that in a moment, but I just wanted to mention that this crisis is very much has two pillars, seen from the education point of view. The first thing is we need to make sure that the people who need access to education and training continue to get it. And that's no small thing, because a lot of learning has moved online and a lot of people don't have the digital skills to get them up the first step on that particular ladder. And secondly, we need to ensure that adequate funding is there for the educational system to continue to perform the crucial role that we all expect of it. I should probably stop right there because I'm preaching to the choir here. None of you would be on the call this morning if you didn't know that already. If you don't mind, let me just make a couple of very brief announcements. One, bizarrely, Education at a Glance. It's a lovely publication. It is also still under embargo, so we can't give you a copy of it until 11 o'clock this morning. but in about 90 minutes, we will be able to share that document with you. This session is on the record. It is being recorded. Recording of the session will be posted later on the Lisbon Council website. If any of you do not want to appear in the video, then please don't turn on your camera and don't join the discussion. Your presence here this morning we take as consent. That said, we'd be delighted if as many of you as possible do turn on your camera. We'd like to see you. We'd like you to experience this meeting as a very warm and a very human one. We have three very good speakers. I've mentioned that already. Andreas will take over the screen in a moment with his presentation. I mentioned also, if you have a question, put it in the chat room. We will still try to call on you, but it helps me. That's the equivalent of raising your hand. It helps me know who wants to ask something, and we'll get to you as soon as we can. The session will run until 10:45, and after that, we'll have a copy of Education at a Glance. Andreas, I've spoken too long, but you sometimes inspire verbosity, at least in me, and you inspire a lot of action as well. But let me give you the floor and thank you for animating this terrific discussion.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for hosting this, but also for your leadership on the human capital front. It's something that we risk to forget in the moment of crisis, when everything turns to the urgent. But I think the long-term future of our economies really depends on the skills that we build for tomorrow. And these are clearly difficult times for education. I don't think there's any doubt about it. If you just look at lockdowns across countries, you can see we've gone through sort of a heavy kind of restriction to the education of young people. For some, it worked digitally, but actually we shouldn't overestimate that as well. I think there have been big losses in the skills of people. And when you sort of think about, what the consequences of this will be for individual earnings, we probably see a dent in 3% of lifetime earnings on average in the OECD countries based on, the school closures that we have already seen. And you can project that to today's economies and you get just staggering figures. The long shadows of school lockdowns on our economic kind of future are just tremendous. Basically, fewer skills means less productivity, means less social participation, means more social transfers. You add it all up and you just get very large numbers of the educational effect on the economy in the long run over the life cycle of today's Corona generation. That's what we calculate here. So clearly the consequences are serious. As I said, some schools, some students did well in learning online, but if you look actually at the data, you just have about half of the teachers, and in the European Union actually less, who are reasonably comfortable with using technology in the classroom. Well, you can see in the, in Europe, you have the best and the worst in a way. Now you have a country, like Denmark, that seems to be really well suited. And then you look at Belgium, that's at the bottom end of the scale. So a lot of variability, but overall, at best, we talk about half of the teachers being ready for the digital world. How do teachers learn themselves? It doesn't look very different. You can see, Italy or UK, they're sort of pretty much on top in Europe, but they're only about half of the teachers themselves learn through online courses, seminars. Very far away from what we see in some of the Asian countries. If you look to Korea, Shanghai in China, basically there, online learning, the virtual world has become the real world for teachers. They're comfortable with this, they're using it every day. But in Europe and much of the rest of the world, also for teachers, the online world is still sort of very patchy. So this kind of remote learning has worked for some, it hasn't worked for many. We just have to be very honest about this, so the learning losses are real. And again, once more, you can see Belgium, pretty much the country where you are today, pretty much at the bottom of it. Very few teachers basically saying, we learn through the digital world. So, and there obviously, Paul, you already spoke to this, the risk to learning and employment. If you think about those who have, are not in employment, not in education, these are still sizable numbers in many countries. And what's interesting, they're not just the low skilled. You know, I've put the low skilled ones in the lower left corner, but you can see also a lot of, you know, people in the lower right corner. These are people who have sort of succeeded in our schooling. They're not coming out too terribly on the PISA score, but still, they're not getting a job and they're not further in education at the age of, you know, youth. And look to Italy, UK, a number of countries which really have sizable shares of young people at serious risk. And we see that, you know, those who haven't, you know, finished school are significantly more at risk to be unemployed. And again, you know, this crisis is going to amplify those effects. I think we have to be cognizant about that is something I think really, really serious. Again, you know, in a country like the Slovak Republic, Greece, France, Spain, Italy, you talk about a very, very significant share of risk of unemployment for those with low skills. Funding is going to be an issue. You know, I think when this, you know, health crisis is turning into an employment crisis, financial crisis, economic crisis, education will feel the pinch. We are always, you know, good at spending for the present. We are not that good in investing in the future. That's certainly true for Europe. That's why we are so heavily indebted. And I think that's something that, you know, we will see in education. Particularly Europe, education in Europe is pretty well shielded from this. It's largely a public enterprise. You're going to see much larger effect in the UK and Japan, you know, United States. That's where actually education depends, particularly in the tertiary level. You see that here heavily on, you know, household spending and to some extent other private spending. That's obviously, you know, much more volatile. But even in Europe, you know, I think both the public purse and private spending will sort of come under pressure. We need to be aware of that for the future. Internationalization, that's perhaps the most obvious implication that we are aware of. You know, closed borders, closed universities mean you just have a lot fewer students. And before the crisis, that used to be a rapidly growing market. Now you had more and more young people going across borders to actually experience, you know, new education, new countries, new cultures. And I think Europe has greatly benefited from this. And by the way, you know, we think about inner European mobility a lot, but actually 60% of international students come from outside Europe, in Europe. So that's been a big kind of plus, and that's suddenly and abruptly coming to a halt. Those young people don't find their academic learning, they can't, and you know, people talk about online learning in university, but you know, who is going to go across borders to consume, you know, online content? People go to university because they want to meet great people. You listen to great lectures, walk in a, you know, amazing laboratory, experience a life on campus. So I think we will sort of, particularly countries that heavily depend on that. You can see them here on this in this chart. You know, Australia, New Zealand are not in Europe, but you look at the United Kingdom, they come next. Switzerland, Austria. The number of countries where actually the share of international students has been very high. In some also the advanced degrees, you know, look at this, you can see masters or equivalent or PhD. Switzerland, more than half of the international students of the students are at the doctoral level are international ones. So that's going to change. And I think universities will need to reinvent this and their value proposition if they want to remain attractive. And if they are not attractive to international talent, you know, good luck to innovation, because I think we got used to international talent. Now we've actually become very good, and you know, graduate employment has been very good. So many of those people who studied have also found jobs. And I think that's going to be, I think, a big bottleneck for the future innovative capacity of our economies. We devote a lot of attention in this year's edition to vocational education and training. That's sort of something that many countries have realized already during the financial crisis. It saved many people's careers. The vocational sector actually has gained a lot in, you know, attractiveness at the labor market. And people study very different fields. You can see that here in the chart. It's vocational education is no longer, just for manufacturing, construction. That's still a significant share. You can see that in green, but you can see this in business, administration, law, health and welfare, even the arts and humanities. So actually across the world, vocational education and training has become a much more diverse sector. It's more about a different style of learning than basically going for a specific field of education occupation. That's happened basically already. That's not a new phenomenon. That happened sort of over the last 10, 15 years. You can see employment rates are very good. Now you can see this is basically at the secondary, non-tertiary level, the kind of intermediate vocational education you talk about in Europe, over 80% employment. If you compare that with those who did not, complete school, they're much more at risk. You saw that already of unemployment. But even, people completing general qualifications have a lower likelihood of being employed. And so I think actually in terms of making a transition to the labor market in Europe and many other countries, vocational education and training has been quite successful. Obviously not as successful as, university education in many countries, but in Europe you can't say that. Actually, the risk of unemployment is pretty much the same for people with a university degree and someone with a decent vocational qualification. So I think that is an important accomplishment. It becomes visible in our indicators, but you can see, the advantage is great at the beginning, for 25 to 34-year-olds, your employment rates are pretty much the same between a university qualification and a vocational degree. But, later on in your career, the employment gap opens up. Vocational education is often, great for your immediate future. It is not yet good enough to actually keep people learning at the workplace and be prepared for the long-term future. I think that's something we need to work on, as you can see from this chart. This is also something earnings, the employment advantage of vocational education and training does not translate into an earnings advantage. Basically, here you can see the the earnings of general education and here vocational education. It varies, in the Czech Republic, for example, you can see a vocational degree gets you a lot more money than an academic degree. But in Finland, it's the reverse. And I think on average across countries, in general, we must say that, it's great for getting a job, is not so great to maximize your earnings in the long run. So I think there's something still to be done to, extract good value from the skills of people in this sector. Now, vocational education and training is a big word. We've actually looked at what's inside it, and what we actually see is that it's the work-based component that it creates most of the value. You can see, for example, people who had no work experience, the employment, that's the red bar, and you can see it's the shortest. No? These are basically vocational people who've studied in vocational education but never, saw a workplace or very few times. You can see actually their employment is not very good. Look at Italy, Greece, Finland, Turkey, and so on. And then, you can see apprenticeship is actually making things a lot better. Mandatory traineeship, where actually the workplace is sort of really integrated as a place of learning. You can see things get even better. And then work outside the curriculum. That's also interesting. In a number of countries, actually, people just do jobs. They just, find their own employment, earn some money. And you can see actually it has almost the same effect as work-based learning. So it doesn't really matter how it's taking place, but the fact that you do have experience at the workplace seems to be a very, very important component driving the employment benefit of vocational education training. And looking at this chart, maybe we should consider this for academic learning as well. What is the reason that people in universities do not have that benefit? And maybe we should, think about ways to better integrate the world of work and the world of learning also on the academic kind of lines of education. At least, that's how I read those kinds of charts. Now, when you look at what's the reality here, you can see the balance. School-based programs are still dominant. Many countries are trying really, really hard, to increase the work-based component, but you need to get employers on board for this, and that's not trivial. Now, that's basically something that many countries are struggling with. You can see the countries, you know, like Denmark, like Switzerland, Germany, and so on. Norway recently, Iceland, UK is trying. You can see it's getting half-half. But then, you know, on the left side, you can see many countries that work hard on this, but haven't yet got employers on board. And that's something I think, as you could see, is going to be critical to make it work in the long run. Another thing that we found to be really, really important, it's the first time that we have data on this, is that you create open pathways. You know, if you create dead ends in vocational education, you have a kind of, you know, poor completion rates. Now, the red bars tend to be shorter than the green bars. If you actually create open pathways, you know, you allow people with a vocational degree to actually study in university, you are much more likely to see successful graduates. That's about, you know, if you're a car mechanic and you want to become an engineer, the tertiary education system should facilitate, not hinder that. And you can see in some countries, it does work out. In a number of countries, I think we need to see a lot more progress on this field. So creating sort of interconnections in education, making sure that pathways are always open. Last point I want to say on this is money. You know, vocational education and training is more expensive than academic learning. Now, putting people into a lecture hall is a lot less costly than providing, you know, expensive equipment and smaller groups and all of this. And often you deal also with a more kind of difficult clientele. And but what you can see, that's not always reflected in cost structures. When you see, for example, a country like Germany or Austria, yeah, they do invest a lot more per vocational graduate than in an academic one, because the enterprise pays for a large part of the training. But then you look at the United Kingdom or Australia, it's the other way around. They put all their money in academic degrees, and, you know, vocational graduates are receiving very little money. And then, surprise, surprise, why is, you know, vocational education not very attractive? You know, the governments in these countries make a lot of propaganda for it, but they always advertise it for other people's children. In a way, you know, what you see here is that the kind of money doesn't back up the claim of providing high quality kind of apprenticeship. And that's important. You know, I think we know from experience that where you do not provide a high quality environment, you know, if your best electrician is at the workplace, but not, you know, in a school, then you want to get your students to the workplace, not to the school in this. And so I think money does matter on this, and not all countries have really got that equation right according to these kinds of data. So that was all on vocational education and training, a big focus of this year's edition. I want to say a few words about, you know, tertiary education, academic education. We see a growing expansion. You know, there are just, you know, the earnings advantage continues to be very, very strong. You can see in many countries now about half or more of women are entering, you know, advanced kind of programs. It varies across countries, but overall, you know, you talk about a good share, more women than men entering, you know, advanced education. And I'm excluding international students. That distorts the picture quite a lot, you know, if you include them in countries that are very attractive. This is just basically, you know, your own nationals going on. You can see the earnings advantage is still very good. You talk about, you know, 50% more lifetime earnings for those people. That's for all tertiary qualification. And then, you know, when you think about a bachelor, it's a little bit less. A master's, a doctor or equivalent, it can be a lot more. So you talk suddenly about 70% in Europe. And in some countries, you know, it's a lot more. Now, that basically is not an indicator necessarily of the quality of higher education. It often reflects the capacity of the labor market to extract value from degrees, and also for, you know, sometimes wage compression. If you look to Norway, for example, Norway is the worst performer. I'm not saying that Norway has terrible universities here, but I'm saying that the Norwegian labor market is not rewarding, degrees to this, or tax system, whatever you want, in sort of converting better skills into better jobs and better lives of people. But what you can see very clearly is that there is every reason for young people to get better qualifications. Now, you actually look at these numbers and you ask yourself, why not more people do that? In some countries in Europe, it's often not attached to great costs, more time than money. And you ask yourself, given those kinds of long-term benefits, why people do not invest more in their future? That's something I think to consider. You can look out also at the, financial benefits for countries. And that's also sort of something really to consider. Government invests, something in the university studies or tertiary studies. You can see for every euro they spend, they get between 3 and 4 euro out of this. So it's not just a good business for people, it's also a really good business for governments. Public money is very well invested in the skills of people. The public returns, the fiscal returns are very strong. And that's really just a reflection of, productivity differentials. People with better skills end up to be more productive. So you get more taxes, you pay less social benefits. So that's behind those numbers. But the numbers are really quite significant. Now, if you think about, where on the capital market would you get anywhere near those kinds of returns in this time? Now, the human capital is probably still a good investment for governments, but it's a long-term investment. That's sort of the tragedy, sort of governments, particularly in these Corona times, very much focused on the short term. And I think those numbers probably are harder to sort of to motivate, to understand. One of the things that we looked at this year also was not just the economic benefits, but also the social benefits. And here's an example of this. For example, people with more advanced levels of skills are more likely to feel that they have a say in what government does. So basically, and that's important too, if you feel voiceless, powerless, that's not just to do with your government, that also has to do with your skill levels. Now, do you have the skills to access knowledge, to contribute, to collaborate? Now, all of those things seem to matter, and it's a consistent trend across countries. Now, basically, the political efficacy, as people call it, is strongly linked to the skills that people have. Now, we should keep that in mind. Let me turn to the other end of the spectrum, the early years. Now, that's also something there where we've seen growing policy attention in most OECD countries, also in Europe, and actually probably most success. If you look, for example, in Europe, 3 to 5 year olds enrollment is now in the 90s in most European countries. That used to be different. If you look, for example, a country like Poland, 2005, was 40%. Then, 2010 was 60%. And now it's 85%. So you can see some countries have seen remarkable progress in expanding access to the early years. And we know again that that's the best investment that you can make in relative terms. Now, basically, the skills of young people, and it's not just about cognitive skills. It's also about, social and emotional skills. It's about, preparing people for, a diverse world. All of this starts early, and you can see a lot has happened. This is, in my, view, the area where you can see real progress. Many other fields, I think, the world has changed much faster than our education system. I think, let's be honest about it. But in the early years, I think we have seen, a good shift towards better access. We've also seen improvements in quality and relevance, and shift from care to education. The early years used to be about mainly care. That's why we, paid staff very little there. And now the educational component gets more at the center. I think that's a very positive development. When you look at the youngest children, the under 3-year-olds, of course, the bars are still much shorter. That's not so much a surprise. Many stay at home. There's a lot of informal, the under, 1, 2, 3, you can see how things are then picking up. But overall, that's where things vary more across countries. Very last point is spending on education. That always ends with money. Here you can see the share of, national income that countries invest in education varying hugely, and Norway being #1. But overall, I think if you add it all up, it's a sizable share of our gross domestic product that goes into education. So I think it's important that we spend it wisely. Of course, that is only one indicator. Probably what matters more is what we actually spend per student. And there you can see big differences between Europe and, for example, the United States. I compare the two here. And what drives that difference is much greater willingness of families and households to invest in education in the United States. In Europe, we get very reluctant when people talk about, university tuition and things like this. In the United States, that's very common. People are more willing to invest private money. And at the end of the day, it means it's a lot more money available per student. I'm not saying it's always well spent. That's another debate. But I think the availability of fund is clearly one of the factors. We also see trends. This is the rise in student numbers, and this is the rise in money. And then you can see in most countries, actually, spending per student has also increased. We are spending more per student now than we did in 2012. And you can say, well, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's often inevitable because salaries rise and the production function doesn't change in education. So the cost structures make education more expensive. But, you look to countries like Hungary, Iceland, the Slovak Republic, Poland, Estonia, you've seen really, really big increases in annual growth. No? 2%, 3%, 5% annual growth means a lot more money in the medium term. No? So that's, I think, really, really important. When you look at the tertiary level, research is a big part in some countries, and it varies a lot. You look to countries like Sweden here or Norway, almost half of the money in a tertiary education goes into research. I think that's a big strength of those systems adding into their future. But if I look to other countries like Poland or Slovak Republic, Czech Republic, Portugal, it's tiny. So basically there, most of the money is absorbed in education, but the research component is still very small. The question is, of course, what's the right balance and how do you ensure that research actually translates to innovation? I think there are many, many challenges involved, but I think availability of funds clearly is part of that kind of picture. Teacher salaries, everybody wants to know, how our teachers paid. When you compare teachers with, university educated workers, they don't come out really well. In Europe, most people with a, tertiary degree earn more than a teacher, but there are some exceptions, for example, in Portugal. There's a lot of complaints among teachers about salaries there, but actually, a lot of tertiary degrees holders fare worse. But Europe in general does well compared with a country like the United States, which comes out at the very bottom here. And now, you tell me, well, you just told us that they spend so much on education. Yeah, but they still pay their teachers poorly. And that, raises big questions about, how money is being invested in a country like the United States. In Europe, you can say almost the opposite. A lot of money goes into salaries. Teachers are paid, not well according to this, but better. But what lacks in Europe is spending in infrastructure, capital investment, particularly digital technologies. Now that's really, I think, where education suffers quite badly. Now it looks a little bit better for school leaders. Now, principals are paid better than tertiary educated workers, particularly in countries where they have a lot of autonomy, like, England. But that's sort of only a small share of the education workforce. And these are not the people who make most of the difference to the outcomes of children. Now, when you look at salaries in absolute terms, one thing that I also think is always important is what career perspectives do teachers really have? And you can see in some countries, there's very little in terms of a career. Teachers, start where they end. that's not very good to keep teaching, attractive. In other countries, you can earn a lot more at the end of the career than at your beginning. So again, it varies. And in some countries, both are good. You look at Luxembourg or Germany or Switzerland, teachers start with a great salary and they end up with an even better one. So I think both can be seen. And that brings me to my very last slide. You can spend your money very differently. We look at all of this every year. For example, compare Japan and Greece. Now, this is the priority that teacher salaries have in their spending. In Japan, the bar goes up, teachers fare quite well. In Greece, the bar goes down. Teachers are very poorly paid. And you tell yourself, wow, that's because Japan is wealthy and Greece is poor. Well, look at the rest. When it comes to instruction time, you can see both Greece and Japan have relatively short school days. So instruction money pulls spending down. But then comes, what do we ask our teachers to do? In Japan, teachers have a significant workload. In the case of Greece, actually, teachers have very little to do, very few hours to teach. And that's actually driving costs upward. But then the big factor is class size. Basically what you can see in Japan, we pay the teachers well and we give them large classes to teach. In Greece, we want teachers to teach small classes and at the end, we can't pay them well. So you can see actually, when you look at spending, Japan and Greece come almost out at the exact same point. When you look at the relative, investment that they make on their, depending on the GDP per capita, Japan and Greece sort of give education the same priority. But they spend their money very, very differently. And that something tells you a lot. That is not just about how much we invest in education. I think the key often is how we invest our money. But I want to stop here so that we have enough time for our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. I think that's a very silent clap because everyone is muted. But I hope you know that the thought behind it was sincere. Listen, before I pass the floor over to Silvia, I'm going to completely abuse my role as moderator and ask you two questions because I can't resist. That was just too exciting. The first one was you very quickly early on mentioned the problem universities are having right now, and in particular, a role that's not often attributed to them enough of attracting international talent. You said, in fact, that they would need to redefine their role to continue attracting international talent because of importance that attractiveness plays in bringing human capital to places and delivering growth and prosperity. I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions how they could rethink their model to continue doing that under the extremely difficult circumstances that we now see. And if I might, I have a second question too, although in some ways it's more of a comment. I don't really expect you to answer this one. But I was struck by the United States having such incredibly high investment in education and low access for 3 to 5-year-olds, which strikes me as an enormous structural problem in the United States. And I guess I wanted to ask if you think that's going to have consequences going forward, or if perhaps we're seeing the consequences already, which might explain some things going on in the world right now. Andreas?
I think the issue of how universities, can modify and advance their value proposition. This is not just the Corona pandemic. I do think in the long run, learning will be less and less a place and more an activity. So as a university, it's not about getting people to your place, but providing learning, providing standards wherever young people are. And I think that's basically, the digital world will play a very big role, but also I think the connection with the kind of employment is going to be very important. A big pull factor could be, if you are a university, you actually provide good inroads, links to a labor market, you're part of the innovation chain. I think the more universities can be part of, the innovation pipeline in countries, I think the more likely they will remain attractive to international talent. But what I don't think works is simply, the content part. We will see the unbundling of, content, delivery, and accreditation. That's what's created the monopolies that we currently see in universities. That's why they can charge you, huge amount of tuition. But that's going to disappear. I think universities should anticipate this, that they cannot, content is going to be universal. delivery is going to be, something that, many others will compete with. You might see, tech companies providing very interesting we see that already. And the accreditation part, think what micro-credentials are going to do this. If I were a university now, I would, look at these things very carefully and redefine it. About the US, actually, that is a structural problem. That is actually, in part, it's ideological. Some people think, the government should be involved in the education of small children. That's basically what you can see some states saying. But it's simply big capacity constraints as well. And, raising the US is a good example. I said, high spending, low salaries. Well, that's not a good recipe. If only every second dollar arrives in the classroom, that's not a good sign for spending efficiency. But I think the lack of investment in the early years is something that the United States will pay a high price for. It's very hard to make up for those kinds of deficiencies in learning. We recently compared the US on learning outcomes among 5-year-olds with the UK and Estonia, and you can see those gaps already there. The kind of social disparities that you can see in the United States in learning, if you don't address them in the early years, you face an uphill struggle.
Yeah, it's a tragic situation, actually. Listen, we're going to go now to Silvia Merisio from the European Commission. Silvia, I'd be curious what you think about Andreas's presentation. And by the way, feel free to ask any questions or make any comments about it. But in addition to that, we would love to hear a little bit about the Commission's plans and priorities in this area. I know you have proposed but not yet received an enormous budget to take on some of these tasks. And we'd like to know how you're going to try to make that work, what the problems you're facing, and of course, as always, how can we help?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me. Fabrizio would have loved to be here with you, and she apologizes for not making it. So Andreas' presentation was fantastic. There are so many insights that could underpin many of the policies we are looking at now, also in the light of the coronavirus crisis. It touches upon a number of aspects, and from early childhood, from access to education, from how the education system can provide better and more efficient learning while in distant learning, tertiary education, vocational education and training. And I'm happy to see that most of the findings are really in line with what we have proposed on the 1st of July with the updated skills agenda for Europe. This consists of 12 actions, very targeted ones, and it really focuses on a number of aspects that Andreas has touched upon. For example, the modernization of vocational education and training system as an alternative, which can also bring to higher educational attainment and to tertiary path, but also a stronger cooperation between business and academia, business and the education area, but also, once again, also the modernization of tertiary education. And Andrea just mentioned as an answer to your last question, the micro-credentials, how this will going to change. In the skills agenda, we see that there is a proposal to go towards a EU approach for micro-credentials. So to see how we can have a common system to certify and use these micro-credentials. So there are really a number of actions that are proposed, and I'm happy to see that, these findings goes in the same direction. On this, of course, there are already a number of actions. I would like to ask Andrea a question about how he sees the digital transformation of the education. So he spoke a bit about the fact that universities, they do not allocate a lot of funding to technology. This is something the Commission is really looking at. I forgot to mention that in the skills agenda there are very ambitious targets, in particular to what concerns digital skills attainment. There is an ambitious target of having 70% of EU population with at least basic digital skills as of 2025. As we know, we are responsible in our unit to draw up the Digital Economy and Society Index. Digital skills levels in the EU, they are not optimal for the moment. We see very disparities between member states, but the average still is that 44% of EU citizens do not even have basic digital skills. But this is not only at the basic level. Also, when we go and see the people that have a little bit more advanced digital skills, they are also lacking in many member states. Then when we go a step further again, and we look at the tertiary education, we see that also ICT specialists are missing in almost all member states. This is a problem because it risks refraining the uptake of digital solution in the economy. So we see now that technologies are pervasive in all sectors of the economy, and we need more and more people able to deploy digital technologies in the economy. But coming back to what we are doing for education, there is another communication supposed to be published in the autumn, which is the Digital Education Action Plan. This is also aiming at increasing digital skills level, promoting media literacy, and promoting more efficient ways for distance learning. On this, ambition needs to be matched by funding. So as you mentioned, Paul, that there is a proposal for a very ambitious budget. We have new instruments. We have this recovery and resilience facility that has been approved by the council now. Discussion with the parliament. I know the honorable member will maybe speak about this later. So there is a big budget. There is a lot that we can do for digital, and there is a lot that we can do for skills in general. So the two main pillars of this fund is that member states invest in a green and digital transition. And this cannot happen if we don't have enough skilled people in the EU. Next to this, we also have the instrument that we know more, the European Social Fund, among the structural funds that can accompany structural reforms in the education system, and Erasmus. Erasmus is a very famous instrument and a very successful one that can boost cooperation between member states and between education institutions, also to improve digital and to help universities and education institutions to go more digital. Finally, there is a new program, the Digital Europe program. Its main objective is to help the digital transition, to help digital technologies to be deployed in the EU. Within this program, there is a small budget compared to what Erasmus is, which is really dedicated to promoting advanced digital skills. How? It aims at fostering the cooperation, as Andrea was saying, fostering the cooperation between academia, research, business, and excellence centers in digital technologies to really go for excellent offer in digital technologies. In this way, we hope to fill a bit and to contribute filling the shortages of digital experts that I mentioned before, but also to foster excellent poles in digital that can deploy digital technology in the EU. I will stop here now, so I'm ready to accept all questions.
Thank you, Silvia. I think I heard you ask a question to Andreas, and let me say, Andreas, if you have a question for Silvia as well, in the spirit of fairness, we'd welcome that too. What was your question to Andreas again?
So I would like to know how he sees this transformation of the universities more towards digital. On the one side, more becoming more digital themselves, but also promoting more digital competencies.
Yeah, I look at digital competences actually in a very wide range. I think it's not primarily about technical competence. It's more about, how do you use, access, manage, integrate, evaluate information? Can we actually can we navigate ambiguity? Can we manage complexity? I think this is where, we need to do a lot more. And universities see themselves still very much as, transmitting the established wisdom of our times. They should become better in helping people question the established wisdom of our times. They should be better in people connecting the dots, thinking across the boundaries of subject disciplines. And I think, again, connecting the world of work and the world of education. We have done a lot of work in vocational education and training to, work-based learning, work-based training. I see no reason why that shouldn't be as important in the kind of academic sector. So I think the more universities open themselves, and put also some of, themselves into question, I think the more successful they will be in tomorrow's world, in the digital world. So that the technical digital skills are the ones that worry me least. You know, I think technology will go a lot more towards humans. I think we don't need to go a lot more towards technology now.
I was going to say my colleague David Osimo is on who's in this meeting, has argued the same thing recently in a paper, that the technical parts are the easy ones. Andreas, did you have a question or perhaps some advice for Silvia?
Yeah, you know, you said, you know, ambition should be matched with funding. I often think, you know, we should match funding with ambition. You know, if I, you know, look at the kind of goals that are being set, you know, are these goals going to be, you know, saving us in the 21st century, where we need everyone to be, you know, not only digitally competent, everyone engaged in knowledge creation, everyone to become a lifelong and life-wide learner? I sort of wonder, you know, do you think that we set the horizon far enough in Europe?
Good. Okay, thank you. Victor, obviously nothing ever happens in a vacuum, and the European Commission's plans are always nice, but we have co-legislators now. Tell us what's your thinking, what's going on in the European Parliament, and how we can all come together to make an impact in this area.
I think what's important is what you mentioned at the end, actually, that we have to come together, because these are difficult times for education, like Andreas has said very well in his presentation. Of course, the current pandemic has really affected the educational systems across the world, especially when we refer to vocational and professional training, because there is more difficult, actually. We speak about the digitalization of education, but we rarely look in details at that and how difficult it is to digitalize vocational trainings, actually. So therefore, of course, I really paid attention to his presentation. I think it's quite important, and I have to underline this, that education is linked with our economies and our societies, and that what has happened in the last couple of months has had an impact on our GDP and on how our economies and societies are going to evolve in the future. So I think one of the key conclusions in this report is that education should be seen as an investment in the future of our societies. Education is not a cost. Education is something that is absolutely necessary if we want to move forward when it comes to adapting our societies to the current needs and to the current evolutions. And of course, education is linked with research and investment in research, like it has been very well underlined, of course, again, in the presentation. So of course, education has a link with the economy, with the societies, with the evolutions. There is a return of that investment in the future, but in the same time, and I like that slide very much, it has a link with how our democracies are actually acting. And of course, the fact that you underline very well that there is a link between the level of education and how people feel empowered in participating in their societies. I think this is a quite interesting slide, and I would like you to show this slide to as many European decision makers as possible, because sometimes we forget that too often. Education empowers people, and this is a key element. And if we want to empower people, we have to invest in education. We cannot have simply ambitions. We have to match those ambitions with concrete fundings. So in the European Parliament, we are currently working on a resolution on education. We are going to have a debate in the first session of October with a resolution. I proposed this resolution. I'm a vice president of the Committee on Culture and Education, and we want to put there a concrete reference to funding. We are calling hopefully for 10% of the relaunch plan that has to go to education. And I look at the relaunch plan. They only refer to education 4 times, but it's just to mention education, no concrete directions. And if we have ambitions, we shouldn't cut the funding for Erasmus. So we cut the funding for Erasmus, but we speak about education, which is quite weird to a certain extent. And we believe this effort has to be matched also at national level. And of course, if we want to speak about doing something on education, we have to work together. Look, we are reopening our schools now, but countries are not discussing with each other. And we have different formats of reopening schools, but no exchange of good practices. And the same thing, unfortunately, happens at university level. We speak about digitalization, but we have huge inequalities at European level. We speak about, and the Commission is going to launch soon, again, their proposal on education. Tomorrow we'll have a common event. I will attend it, and I'm really happy that the Commission is doing something on that. I think the Commissioner Maria Gabriel really does a good job on this. But in the same time, we don't we should do more than simply launching actions and ideas, 12 ideas, 10 ideas. We had so many ideas for the future. We have to have milestones with concrete steps that have to be done by member states, but also by us at European level. And we have to invest in professors. Andreas underlined very well the importance of having skilled professors in education. They are a key element in the educational process. And now, especially in the current context, we've also understood that it's important also to invest in parents. We didn't see that before the pandemic, but parents have a key role in making sure that their kids are really paying, involved in the educational process, and they are part of their education, especially when we have school closures and everything. So we really have to do that as well. It's a new trend, and I think we have to do more for that in the same time. So if we come back to skills, I think it's important again to see which skills we are targeting. And we have two dimensions regarding education, underlined also in the study: access to education, but also which type of education, and what is our common understanding of quality access to education or quality education. So I think this is also an important element reflected in the slide that was presented on how we spend our money. So it's good to have the money, but it's important to look on how we are spending the money and how we are tackling all of this issue. I really believe, and this was underlined just recently by the two speakers before me, that we need to have a co-creation of education at global level with teachers, parents, pupils, students, NGOs, local authorities, everyone involved in the process. Education is not just something isolated in our society. It's part of our entire society. It defines our societies. So therefore, it has to have a bigger role. At European level, the European Parliament supports strongly in having a European education area for real. So something that really works. We have delayed too much this implementation of this European education area. We have to do more on that. And just to refer on vocational training, I think it's important again to look at the fact that we need to invest more. It costs a lot, but it's really important. We really have to introduce professional experiences there. And we have to, again, do as much as possible in offering future opportunities for the people following vocational training, for them to go if they want to another level of education or to simply identify a job. So a lot of issues, a lot of ideas. I think what's important to underline is, this is my last element, for all of those issues, there are also solutions that are being underlined in the report and that are being underlined by many European decision makers. And I think we really have to focus today a lot on those solutions and working together. And I congratulate the Lisbon Council for doing this event, because I think it's a good step forward in identifying common solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And once again, I'm going to abuse my position as moderator and ask you a question. We have programs, and I've been doing this long enough that I've seen probably half a dozen skills initiatives. These things come, they go, and I wonder why Andreas's slides look more or less the same year in and year out. My question is this: what can we do this time around that's different? How can we structure this budget, take this budget and spend this money where it actually delivers? I think, Silvia, you said the goal is 70% of the population with digital skills by 2025. That's an enormous, ambitious goal. And as you know, the Lisbon Council was set up around a European goal to make Europe the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy. We're very good at goals. We're maybe not quite as good at roadmaps. What can we do to make this time a success?
I think you said it. We need a roadmap with milestones, with concrete steps, and measure it all the way, and really, let's say, work together on this and following that through till we fit the targets. So at European level, we have the European semester format. And in there, we have references to education, but no one is really paying attention to that. And the European semester matches the OECD actually objectives to a certain extent. So I think we really have to rebuild that format. And of course, in the same time, focus investment where we really need it, and not simply just mentioning somewhere. So I think the roadmap is the key element to making this working in the future.
Yeah, and for the record, I very much support your idea of using the semester process for this. It sounds like a boring bureaucratic answer, but actually it matters. It has some teeth, and it can get the right kind of discussion going at the right time. Andreas, did you want to come back on that point before we open the floor to questions?
I agree with this. I think the European semester actually is a good progress to just create awareness. A lot happens when people are aware, when people kind of see the consequences of action, the consequences of inaction. I think that's where everything starts. But the other part is, I don't think public policy can do this alone. This is a whole of society project, and I think Europe, in my view, can do better to engage the enterprise sector, the kind of private sector, not just in the implementation of education, but also in the design. In vocational education training, it's happening now, but I do think parents, I think Victor said that really well. We have, in a way, very much sort of in the last decade commodified education. Students became consumers, parents became clients, and teachers became service providers. And that has created a distance, actually, I think, that has been very unhealthy. I think we need to bring that back to see what can everybody do to make things different.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Listen, we have a tradition at the Lisbon Council, at least we did back when we used to meet in person, and it was called the Frequent Flyer Award. It was the person who traveled the farthest to be with us. And I believe today the winner of that is Peter Gluckman, whom I see coming to us all the way from New Zealand. Thanks for joining, Peter. It's a pleasure to have you. I see you in what looks like a very quiet house there, so I hope you haven't woken anyone up.
No, I'm there with my whiskey.
Okay. Would you like to join with a question or comment? And it really is a pleasure.
Comment. I mean, it's interesting. Last time I was with you at the Lisbon Council, it was Andreas and I speaking together on some of the matters that he raised again today, earlier this year. I want to go back to Andreas's talk. We focus a lot on the teacher and the institution. We need to start focusing on the individual who's being taught more and more. There's a huge crisis. I released a report from our centre in New Zealand last week, pointing out that in the last decade, mental health issues in the 15 to 25-year-old age group, which are our upper secondary school and tertiary students, has doubled from about 10% of the population in developing countries to 20 to 25%, depending on how it's measured. Now, we cannot expect to teach our students if they have non-optimal mental well-being. And the issue is what is going on in the world that there's been a doubling in the rates of mental health morbidity in the last decade. We need to understand that. Now, and I happen to agree with Andreas, and I think the evidence is increasingly important that dealing with that starts in early childhood education and promoting psychological resilience through the skills, because we're dealing with a world where change is on top of us and young people are not coping. Okay, the second issue I want to raise is that again came at the end of Andreas's talk, which is the one about universities still teach in disciplinary silos. And the OECD in June this year released a fabulous report on the rise of transdisciplinarity and the need for universities start to think about transdisciplinary education that's out there to solve and engage with the stakeholders and the problems of the world. The third point I want to raise is one that I worry about a lot in New Zealand because, as Andreas's slide shows, we're taking the biggest hit, or one of the biggest hits, from the collapse of export education. And I don't think it will ever return to normal because I think actually the world is now on a pathway towards a lot more digital education. But one of the elements of digital education we've not been thinking about, but which I know the UNESCO Centre in Delhi is thinking a lot about, is the potential of digital education to become personalized education. How will we use artificial intelligence and live feedback from the student's response to personalize the education of the next generation? So I think there's some real opportunities here, but there's some real risks here. And we need to do a lot more educational research, a lot more psychological research to think about how education will evolve in the digital world. But I come back to the first point. We cannot teach people if their mental well-being is not optimal.
Okay, thank you. And Peter, I'm failing as a moderator here because I didn't ask you to introduce yourself, so I will briefly. For those of you who don't know Peter, and that's probably no one on this call, but he is the director of the Koitu Institute in New Zealand, the Center for Informed Futures, and the former chief science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, where he actually created the job, which I know is much harder than simply having it. If you don't mind, Andreas, let's take a couple more questions and we'll come back towards the end to the speakers, if that's okay with you, even though I know those were all meaty questions, but this can be a little memory test for you, a bit like the ones you give students on PISA. Elisa Kortinska, you asked from Forster, you asked a question a little while ago. If you're still here, would you like to unmute and ask your question directly? Are you still here? Is she still here, Krissa? She asked a question early in the meeting.
Yeah, she's still here and her microphone is on.
Hi,
Hello.
can you hear me?
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning, it's Elita here. Thank you very much. Yeah, so one of my questions was about the mismatch basically in terms of demand and supply in the labor market. So the skills that are supplied and the demand that actually business looks for. And there's certainly evidence for mismatch, and how are we gonna move towards filling that gap on one side. And on the other hand, my second question relates to the decision-making in terms of education policy on EU level. It remains an area where competences fall in the national institutions predominantly, and all initiatives are still voluntarily, so there is no really a pan-European educational approach. Do you think member states after the pandemic would be willing to give up some of those powers in order to achieve educational transformation, and from what I hear in that conversation, also cultural transformation in terms of how we approach education altogether?
Good, thank you. And I'd like to call also on Richard Ekstein from the Swedish Universities Association. If you could introduce yourself and ask your question. And you can turn your camera on too. We'd love to see you. Hey, but you're mute. There you are. No? Do you maybe, are you sorted? Richard, I think you're still having mic problems. Look, I'm gonna go to someone else, but try to resolve that. We'll come back to you in a moment. Jaime, would you like to ask, Jaime Quesado from Portugal, would you like to ask your question, and can you introduce yourself, please?
I have a problem with my son. Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Paul, and my congratulations for this excellent program. I'd like to make a question to Andreas about the sense of community, because I think that with this pandemic, it will be very important that teachers and the families try to reconnect in a different way. And how do you think that the school and the programs and the way that learning will be done will reinvent this kind of community that will be essential for this new time we are facing? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Richard, did you get your mic problems fixed? No, doesn't sound like it. Okay. Andreas, would you like to come back on a couple of these questions briefly?
Yeah, you know, I think there is always going to be some level of mismatch between the demand and supply of skills, because our economies are changing, the demands are changing. But I think the best way to protect ourselves is simply to broaden the way in which we educate people. If we sort of focus people very narrowly on a specific mission, that mission changes, they are at risk. If we provide people with a kind of more solid foundation so that they can actually, you know, continue learning throughout lives, adapt their skills, I think we're putting people on a much safer and much more kind of long-term track. But obviously, I think you're also right that, you know, we can do more in the short term. I think many education institutions don't have that great incentives to even listen to the evolution of skill demand. You know, universities often provide courses that are easy and cheap to provide rather than, you know, what's most relevant. I think, you know, thinking about incentive structures, I think, is important here. No? And I think that's, you know, governments should think, you know, what are they going to fund? And people should think, you know, it's also about, you know, providing people with good information. And then last but not least, it's the same point, making, you know, work-based learning more a reality of every learning. You know, if people have direct experience in the labor market, they're going to get a sense of what skills are really relevant and what are important. Maybe if I add one point, we talk about careers and skill match when people graduate. Actually, I think, your most important career decisions you make in primary school. That's when you decide, am I going to take school serious or not? Where am I going to put my efforts and so on? I think so giving children in school a better sense of, the real world outside them. And schools are very good in keeping students inside and the rest of the world outside. I think opening up, education early on, I think it's also a good guarantee to ensure better skill match later on. But let's be serious, the world is changing. It's not the idea that we can prepare people once for their life for a specific skill set. I think that's an idea of the past. This point about pan-European vision of education, I think, is a very, very good one. Education is still too much perceived to be a domestic field of policy, and that is, in an interconnected world, no longer adequate. On the positive side, I do see a dramatically growing interest in connecting with other countries, with other systems after the corona pandemic. Ministers are talking to each other much more intensively. Over the weekend, there was a big G20 conference on this very same topic. So I think we are on a quite good track. Just briefly on this issue, I think this community part, I think, is also very important. I think this is probably the one thing the corona pandemic has really taught young people. Learning is not a place, learning is an activity, and learning is not a transactional business, but always a relational business, where you have, teachers who, relate to you in this crisis, understand, who you are as a learner, where you have parents who are supportive, where you have this ecosystem that is, conducive to learning around you, you'll be fine. Where you are just, a consumer, a recipient, I think that's where you were in trouble in this crisis. So again, I think it's a very, very important point, how we build more kind of social capital within education.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Ricardo, you sorted now?
Can everyone hear me better this time?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, my question originally was just a point of clarification for Victor, because I picked up on what he was saying about the voices in Parliament calling for 10% of what I understood was the Next Generation EU instrument to be invested in education, which I think was a good idea. So I just wanted to clarify, because I couldn't see that in the resolution that the Parliament did in July, whether that was just a personal desire or is that something that the European Parliament is calling for. But in any case, I think that's a good idea, because I'm calling from the network of universities in South Sweden. I think obviously seeing how the outcome of the summit went with the budgets that are looking likely to be going to Erasmus and Horizon Europe, which are far from sufficient. So I think from a university perspective, I think there's a need to look more in general to instrument like Next Generation EU, and for all universities also to effectively be lobbying their national governments to make sure that education and research is given an important role in these national action plans that will be developed to implement all of these funds. So, but maybe if you could say a bit more on that demand that the European Parliament is making, that would be great. Thank you.
Victor, if you don't mind, we'll save that for the end, because I want to take at least one more question and we're almost out of time. Alicia, I think you asked a question some time ago, and thank you for joining. I think you're on.
Yes, okay. So my question generally concerns the importance and the urgency of making citizenship education one of the pillars of all kinds of education, because we are living in times where really decisions and ideas and visions of how society should function, what a good government is really impacting all other areas of life. So without this civic literacy and without the funds and efforts to really build more resilient communities on the local scale, but also on the national and European scale, many efforts going into different types of education will be lost, because you only can make rational decisions and fight inequalities when you are really have the power and the voice in the whole social system that you're functioning. So I am just appealing for more citizenship education in all kinds of levels.
Okay, thank you for that. In that case, we need to wrap up now, and I apologize, we've gone a minute or two later, and Andreas, I hope we haven't cut into your coffee time, because I know you have yet another presentation to give at 11, since it's a very big day, and we're absolutely thrilled to have had a little bit of your time on a day this special. Silvia, would you like to come back on some of these points or say anything about what's been said, and then we come to you, Victor, and then we give Andreas the last word.
Yes, thank you. So as a last word, just mentioning that the European semester will be strongly linked to the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and the plans that are about to be submitted by the member states will also contain, hopefully, milestones and targets for which we can, under the European semester process, monitor the achievement of certain targets, being it the establishment of reforms or new investment promoted also on national level. So let's see if this is going to work. And then, of course, there has been, during the pandemic, concerning the question about interest of member states in the European education area and the willingness of cooperating more, there was a call for more integration from some member states. Now, of course, the process, it's always a bit lengthy when it comes to the council, but let's see if it is sustained also after the lockdown period. But things are evolving both on the side of the Digital Education Action Plan and the European education area. So discussions are ongoing. And let's see that if this cooperation that involves also other stakeholders, as Andreas mentioned, it's a big effort, it's a joint effort, private organizations, governments, education institutions that they need to undertake all together.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I don't need to tell you, Silvia, sometimes politics or policy making or whatever it is that we do here in Brussels, sometimes it's a contact sport. And I wanted to propose that we suspend all that. I hope you know everyone on this call would love to work with you to make this a success. And I hope that we all can. You control a very important lever, and we're counting on the Commission to pull it. And you will have everyone's support in that too. And on that note, I pass the floor to Victor for any final thoughts and comments and a couple of questions that you got along the way there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Indeed, like you said, I think it's about working together. And just to refer to competencies, it's not about giving up competencies, it's about building together new competencies on education. And we have the European Universities Initiative that is working rather well. And you see, no one is disturbed by that. Everyone wants to get access to it and want to work together. The European education area, it's an important step forward. We recognize so many things at European level, but we don't recognize, diplomas everywhere, or we don't recognize school years in another country, which is not normal. It's so easy to do that. So we simply need to do that. So indeed, of course, we are currently working on a resolution, like I said, it's going to be approved in October. We have an amendment on the 10% that should be allocated from the relaunch plan for education. My feeling is that it is going to be approved. In the same time, we already have the 10% in other documents that have been approved by our committee. And it is there also in the INI report on shaping digital education policies that I'm leading, and there was a document released just this week. So I'm strongly campaigning for it, and I believe there is a lot of support coming from all political groups in making this a strong political message of the European Parliament. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. One of the benefits that comes from age is you see a lot of things happen. And a decade ago, the Lisbon Council rather boldly and rather insanely called for a doubling of the Horizon 2020 budget and a doubling of the Erasmus budget. And to my amazement, that actually happened. And I don't think we were the only ones. We were certainly involved in that discussion. So what I'm trying to say, Victor, is sometimes what you're trying to do, that can work. So let's push for that, because it would be really nice if this recovery plan could get behind improving the education system and improving access to education in a meaningful way, as we discussed, not just a budget to spend, but a budget that reaches people and gets them trained. Andreas, it is always a pleasure. And unfortunately, it's going to take me about a month to understand and unravel everything I've learned in this talk today. I look forward to going through your study. Would you like to have the last word?
Oh, I thank you, Paul, and I do think the European Parliament and the Commission, I think, are so important in this time to ensure that Europe sees its long-term future. That we are not, compromising the important over the urgent. Our schools today is going to be our economy, our society tomorrow. And to the last question that was raised, good education is always also good citizenship education. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And listen, just briefly, since we're way.
Thank you. Bye.
We're way over time, but there are three groups of people I need to thank briefly. First of all, our speakers, thank you so much. Secondly, the OECD, because I know, Andreas, that there's a village that stands behind you. So thank you for facilitating this, presenting this fantastic study, and to your whole team for producing this. And finally, I need to thank all of you. Thanks for taking time on a busy Tuesday morning. It's really appreciated. Now let's work together and fix some of these problems. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Morning. Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.